is still unable to fully protect the Crimean Peninsula. This is something that we've known before, as the Crimean Peninsula has been struck before in this war in Ukraine. But now it's being struck again shortly after Putin visited the peninsula, and people were talking about where's the Ukrainian attack. Well, here it is after Putin left. Vladimir Putin recently was in Mariupol. Now, this had a lot of amazing moments of totally not scripted encounters where he's talking to somebody right now who's claiming like, oh, I had no clue you were going to be here, Vladimir Putin. But they all were like set up in a perfect group at the perfect place outside this home before Putin came, and it just so happened to be in front of the newly built buildings in Mariupol and none of the burnt out buildings, which they also happened to come during the nighttime. From what I heard, the reason Vladimir Putin came during the nighttime would be so it's harder to see all the burnt out windows and destroyed buildings in the background because they don't have any lights or anything to highlight the fact that they've been destroyed. But during the scripted interaction, at about this moment, actually I think it was about right here in the video. You hear somebody yelling in the background, as you can hear part of it as I just played, and they're yelling, it's all not true, it's all for show. Vladimir Putin goes into this occupied Ukrainian territory, starts trying to do the PR circus where he runs the media circuit with all of these totally not scripted beforehand, totally not placed in the perfect positions in front of these perfectly constructed buildings outside of the way of any of the burnt down buildings beforehand. Does this all totally spontaneously, and even with all of this totally spontaneous control that they placed over the environment while he was visiting Mariupol, the city that he basically flattened into a car park, somebody who lives there sees what's going on, gets to the window and yells at the top of their lungs so people know that this is all for show. The locals hate him. They don't want Putin here. All of this is fake. They're not seeing what Mariupol is actually like after the Russian presence, where the Russian military acted less like a military force in Mariupol and more like a natural disaster, flattening everything in sight that dared to resist their oncoming army. And so this led to a few clowns online, this interview, this interaction, like this guy right here, like really freaking out at the idea of like, wow, why did Zelensky allow Putin to travel to Ukraine today? Where are their air defenses? Where are their soldiers? Why aren't the Ukrainians afraid of Putin? And so the reason he's saying that is because Putin was able to visit Mariupol and they didn't kill him, which I guess is the first complaint here. Like, why didn't the Ukrainians assassinate the president of Russia while he was visiting occupied Ukrainian territory, while also guarded by some of the best soldiers in Russia and probably very strong protection with anti-air active in the area? Why weren't they able to kill Putin? Definitely considering he didn't announce his visit in advance, because that would have endangered him. Zelensky has visited Bakhmut, an area much closer to a stronger contingent of Russian soldiers than how close Putin is here to the front line, and Zelensky was fine. And he's done this on multiple occasions. He visited Severodonetsk when that battle was going on near the front line, and he visited Bakhmut near the front line. So the idea that Vladimir Putin was not able to visit the front line, but was able to visit something that was, what, how far away is Mariupol from the front line at this point in the war? It would be this far away, like hundreds of miles away from the front line. The idea that that Putin was able to visit this, that's impossible to believe, but it's totally reasonable for somebody to believe that Zelensky was able to visit Bakhmut. He was able to visit this. Obviously, it was months ago when they were in a better position, but it is easy to believe that Putin was able to do this. It's also easy to believe that he wasn't able to keep up the stunt for very long, and there was Ukrainians off screen yelling at him for destroying their city. He doesn't post that, of course. Dom, of course, is not going to post that audio. He instead says, why aren't the Ukrainians afraid of Putin? Showing all of the locals who were pre-scheduled to meet Putin not being afraid of him, as if, Vladimir Putin is coming to Mariupol as some great liberator. Not digging any further to see all the audio of people yelling at Putin, saying they don't want him here, that this is all fake, and just accepting the state media propaganda face value, not thinking that Vladimir Putin would have these people screened in advance whatsoever. This isn't like street interviews. This isn't like Sneeko going out to random Russians asking them their opinion on Vladimir Putin. This isn't 1420. This isn't like, I don't know, like college campus change my mind, Stephen Crowder. Like, this isn't any of that. This is him going to these pre-scripted, pre-planned events to meet people in advance, and that's enough to convince this clown. But after all this happened, after all these ideas of like, wow, why is Crimea not being struck? Because he didn't only visit Mariupol. Before he visited Mariupol, he also visited Ukraine. Oh, not Ukraine. I mean, Crimea, which isn't Ukraine, but Crimea. Now, today, and this is the big news that's been on the internet for the last 4 or 5 hours, the Ukrainians have struck Crimea. The reports are saying that what was struck was a Russian cruise missile. It was destroyed in Crimea, and that's what the strike was for. Now, we have yet to see any photos published of the destroyed cruise missile. We have yet to see any evidence provided yet of the destroyed cruise missile. We have yet to see any posts from like Russian military bloggers saying, yes, it was destroyed like that. Right now, this is just a claim that's floating in the air, waiting to be verified or debunked. But it is true that the Ukrainians did strike Crimea. The mystery clap continues the process of demilitarization of Russia and prepares the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea for deoccupation, the intelligence service added. Meanwhile, Crimean Gudalier Oskanov reported about the successful work of the air defense. Well, yes, judging by the videos, the Russian air defense decided to sleep. The main thing is not to panic. Xi hasn't left yet. Oh, yes, so this is also all going on while Xi Jinping is still in Moscow, which is the next segment we're going to talk about. Here's the footage of the attacks happening, which what seemed to be Ukrainian drones striking across the peninsula. You can kind of hear it too, the drone operating in the background.
Вон полетел, да, вон. Ой, блядь, он прям соседи падает, что ли, да? Ёб твою мать. Он прям рядом лупил. Ай-яй-яй, не в дом хоть попал, а? На железку, да, упал?
This isn't the only video, there's some others, like this one.
Пиздец.
Пацаны съебываются, что тут хуярит. Походу.
Нас обстреливают. Дрон ударит, они пиздец, блядь, повязал на ушах. Сука, дым летит третий, блядь, дом.
Вон там дым, блядь, плохо видно. Дым сверху. Еще. На. Все с вокзала съеб.
And so, like, this is all just like repeats of the same, like, basically the same audio at different places all across the peninsula. So we don't know for sure exactly what has been destroyed, what hasn't been destroyed. This does show that Russian air defense in Crimea, very shortly after Putin visited Crimea, while Xi Jinping is in Moscow, is still unable to deal with Ukrainian drones, which are not flying particularly fast. They were able to make their way through air defense during the nighttime and strike their targets across the peninsula, which does indicate that Russian air defense, despite how active it is or how modern the Russians are claiming it is, and how good it is, according to the Russians, is still unable to fully protect the Crimean Peninsula. This is something that we've known before, as the Crimean Peninsula has been struck before in this war in Ukraine. But now it's being struck again shortly after Putin visited the peninsula, and people were talking about where's the Ukrainian attack. Well, here it is after Putin left. I am kind of surprised that so shortly after Putin left, we see the peninsula so vulnerable to just like drone attacks, not even like like long-range missile attack or caliber cruise missile or anything like that, just drones, slow-moving drones. Pretty shocking. You could hear them trying to shoot down the drones with just like shoulder-mounted machine guns. It's pretty shocking, man. Pretty shocking. Anyway, moving on from that, moving to Moscow while this drone attack was going on, Xi Jinping, the leader of China, arrived in Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin. Look at him. Look at him getting off the plane with that very stylish black jacket with no other colors. Okay. Maybe it's very cold.
Да, китайский лидер, да, идет вдоль почетного караула. Я напомню, еще заявление Си Цзиньпинь сделал буквально недавно, что рассчитывает обсудить с Владимиром Путиным важные региональные международные темы, представляющие взаимный интерес для...
Okay, you get the idea. They meet in Moscow, they talk about the things, yada, yada, yada. You get the idea. But I want to move on to what they actually said during the meeting, because as the Russians are dealing with the war in Ukraine, the Chinese are saying that they're neutral on the war, as Politico and other magazines are reporting about small amounts of Chinese guns being funneled into the country while being called hunting rifles and other things. And the United States is accusing China of possibly considering funding Russia's war, as they're talking about the consequences of U.S. expansionism of NATO. And people are thinking that Xi might make the bet that it's easier to support Putin now and support his war effort in Ukraine than it is to deal with the possible economic and international repercussions of him backing his war financially or militarily with weapon shipments or weapon sales. I don't necessarily know if they're going to do it. I think China might make the calculation that if they send weapons to Russia to be used in Ukraine, that could just mean an escalation of American aid to Ukraine. That could also mean a possible escalation over Taiwan. It would also mean that any agreements that were made behind closed doors between the United States and China over trying to stop American long-range missiles from getting in the hands of the Ukrainians, or American F-15, F-16 jets getting in the hands of the Ukrainians, in exchange for Chinese generals talking to Russian generals, trying to talk them down from the idea of nuclear escalation, and an agreement for the Chinese not sending any weapons to Russia, all of that would become null and void. Those conversations were leaked by the press already. And so if there is any conversation like that behind closed door, if that all happened, did happen and is true, as I believe it to be, then this could completely throw all of that out the window. And that's the calculation the Chinese have to make right now.
Visit between two powerful strategic partners is being watched around the world. For the first time since Russia invaded Ukraine, China's Xi Jinping is in Moscow meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Ukraine is, of course, expected to top the agenda of the three-day trip, with Beijing framing itself as a peacemaker. Mr. Xi says that China will work with Russia to, in his words, safeguard the international order.
It is true that both of our countries share the same or similar goals. We have exerted efforts for the prosperity of our respective countries. We can cooperate and work together to...
You know what's great for Russian prosperity? In the middle of a demographic crisis, invading another country to make more Russians leave your country as economic and political refugees, while throwing the remaining loyal citizens into the gunfire of Ukrainian machine guns in Bakhmut. That seems like something that's very prosperous for the future of Russia.
To achieve our goals.
The meeting comes just days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin on war crimes charges. Just walk us through what Xi Jinping at this point needs from Russia.
Well, Xi Jinping, I mean, by traveling to Russia just after securing this unprecedented third presidential term, he's making very clear, he's sending a message to the West, to the world, where his priorities lie. And even though, his economic relationship with the United States and NATO is hugely important in terms of dollars, that's not Xi's priority. His priority is ideology. And he and Vladimir Putin share the belief that the world order as it has existed for the last 70 years, ensured by the United States, is a world order that needs to change. They believe that the system of democracy, the cultural liberalism, is a disgrace, and they want to see the world aligned more the way that their countries are, where they are controlled very heavily by the government. And so this is a bigger issue for President Xi than just Vladimir Putin's, war crimes charges in the International Criminal Court, bigger than the war in Ukraine itself. This is about combining the powers of these two nuclear-armed authoritarian superpowers, and using that combined power to shape the course of the world order for the future. They both believe that this is their mission, and so this meeting, these 3 days, the decisions that.
Dude, it is so wild to me that Putin, I'm just thinking about this right now. Putin is meeting with Xi Jinping.
Flemmy got a tier 3 subscription.
Whoa!
Don't look at my white name. It's a lie. Slander. There never was a white name.
No, we don't allow the whites in the site chat. Never the whites. Thank you so much for the tier 3 sub. You joined one of the highest tiers of my Dylan Burns TV cast system. I deeply appreciate you reinforcing the social order I've established in order to bring me wealth and prosperity while living in a war zone. I appreciate that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Next time it's tier 4. Damn, Flemmy is completely buying into the multi-leveled marketing scheme. I appreciate it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Even if we've got a few white names still in chat, like Senny over there, Senny Tanol. I can't believe we allow whites in the site chat. So it was nice knowing chat before the nuclear war, and good luck to the next species that takes place over after we nuke ourselves. This is the thing, though, right? This is the thing that I know Putin considers, right? Whether or not, and this is the one thing I just still can't get my head around when people talk about nuclear war. If Putin starts a nuclear war, Russia's also on the world, so he doesn't want the world to explode because Russia's also there. And I know that's something that annoys him to deep ends, that he can't blow up the world because Russia's on the world, but it's also something China doesn't want. If Russia was to use a nuclear weapon, no matter how aligned China wants to be with Russia, they're not going to endanger the world, including themselves, exploding over Russia's ambitions in Ukraine. They're not going to risk it. If Russia was to do that, this is one of the few scenarios where China actually agrees possibly to a price cap of Russian energy exports. And so that's another reason I think holding the Russians back. I remember somebody said, I think it was last stream, I think it was Mon, I forget his full name, said that the reason that I left Ukraine last time was because I was scared of nuclear retaliation. I don't know who started that rumor. It's completely not true. I left to spend Christmas with my family. I've never been particularly scared of a nuclear weapon being used. If it was going to be used, the first place it would be used would be here. But I believe there's just so many incentives against it that I'm willing to put myself in Ukraine, I guess, as my own personal hedging against that. You know, I've put my chips on the table, so to speak.
That they make, the conversations that they have, seem to be solidifying this, as they've called it, their no limits partnership. And you see Xi Jinping trying to show China's force, not only militarily and economically, but also in diplomacy, brokering that peace deal in the Middle East recently between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Okay, I'm sick of this. This has been something since the Trump administration. It is not a peace deal to open embassies. I saw people say that Trump negotiated a peace deal between like the UAE and Israel. No, Israel and the UAE were not at war. They weren't killing each other. It's not a peace deal. They were able to open embassies. They were able to open negotiations. They were able to open lines of dialogue and lines of communication. That is very different than a peace deal. If we were to reopen an embassy in America, an American embassy in North Korea, that does not mean we signed a peace deal with North Korea. That means we opened an embassy with North Korea. I'm sick of people calling it that. You can compliment it as a good thing, but don't like overexpand what it was. Because no peace happened because Iran and Saudi Arabia opened up embassies. That didn't end the war in Yemen. That didn't end proxies fighting across the Middle East. Didn't do any of that. All of this stuff is still happening under the current arrangement between the Iranians and the Saudis in the Middle East. The balance of power did not shift to stop that fighting. The fighting is still going on.
And making sure that that deal, none of the official documents would be in English. This is what Xi has always felt is an inevitable revival and rise of China. And he does not want the United States and the West standing in that way. Now, an embarrassing defeat in Ukraine for the West is not something that would disappoint Xi Jinping. So that is why there's growing concern that he's considering these arming of lethal weapons, ammunition, because we know that the U.S. believes that Russia might not have any serviceable ammunition before the end of this year. That's something that China can help them with, along with microchips and other types of weapons that could...
To be clear, though, if the Chinese give weapons to the Russians to use in Ukraine, that basically is going to be a signal to Washington that all bets are off. We can basically send whatever we want to Ukraine with no repercussions anymore, because I think the reason to holding back, as the negotiated leaks showed, is because of the Chinese. So the Chinese put their chips on the table, long-range missiles, American chips, all that stuff now is brought to the forefront. And now it's no longer just a conflict between Russia and Europe and the United States. It's now a conflict between Europe, United States, Russia, and China. And that escalation in the conflict is only going to lead to more aid. It would be devastating for Ukraine, because it would expand the conflict even more with more guns flowing in on both sides, meaning that both sides are going to have more devastating weapons, meaning more destruction. But also the other outcome for Ukraine is just sell away all of its territory, give the Russians what they want, which obviously is something that is incomprehensible to them. They don't want to give up their freedom. The best thing for the Chinese to do here is just not get involved. Don't get their weapons dumped into the dumpster fire that is a Russian invasion of Ukraine. The least well-managed invasion of another country in the entirety of the 21st century.
Could really change the course for Russian soldiers on the battlefield. So what happens over the next few days of discussion, Zane, is going to have huge ramifications for the war in Ukraine and beyond.
We'll see what happens. I'm sure you'll be watching very, very closely. Will Ripley live for us there. Thank you so much. And it's time now for the exchange and a conversation with Yun Sun. She's a senior fellow and co-director for China at the Stimson Center, a Washington think tank. Thank you so much for being with us. Just walk us through at this point why you think Russia needs China and vice versa.
Thank you very much for having me. I think the reason why Russia needs China at this point is quite clear. Russia has been under severe international sanctions since the beginning of the war, and its economic partners on the international market has become increasingly limited, and the source of foreign funding, especially investment, has also become limited. China is Russia's largest neighbor, and China also shares this anti-U.S. agenda with Russia. So evidently, China has appeared or emerged as one of the few partners that Russia can still rely on in this precarious condition. Then from the Chinese perspective,
hey, Captain TPT just gifted me gave a tier 1 sub to Tenny, saying having a white name in site chat is almost as bad as being in gutter chat. Let's fix that. Thank you, Captain TPT, longtime supporter of the channel. I appreciate that.
I think the most important consideration remains to be geopolitics. And by geopolitics, the Chinese would mean, well, the great power competition or the strategic competition with the United States. No matter what, and regardless of the result of the war in Ukraine, China sees Russia as a partner, or as a partner that shares the same vision about the need to counter the U.S. hegemony in the world. So,
well, I guess like China views it like this: if Russia was to go down, then in a lot of ways, let's say that this invasion is botched, they completely pull out, Russia's government collapses, then they have rebels in Chechnya, Abkhazia and South Ossetia go up in smoke. Maybe the Azerbaijanis feel emboldened and they attack Armenia, so Russia might be tied up in Armenia. What happens to a lot of Central Asian countries who have put their national security in the hands of the Russian alliance? What happens there? Would there possibly be lawlessness in Belarus as well with Lukashenko? Would there possibly be other problems in the Caucasus with other ethnic groups outside of the Chechens who are going to want independence? Because there are other groups who have talked about independence. Would there be political discontent within Russia as other radicals would try to rise up to take the hold, possibly being people of either completely different political stripes than Putin or people even worse than Putin? What would people like Kadyrov do if his power gets threatened in Chechnya? He's going to crack down hard. It's going to get violent. It's going to get bloody. In this process, if that was to happen, that would mean a pole, an international pole in the world, Russia, that could have been useful to China in helping to balance against the Americans, because then America's distracted with Russia. They have a possible ally on the international stage in the Security Council and on the world to help in countering America, whether it be in the Middle East or in other places, is now gone. And now America can possibly even more concentrate on this idea of a pivot to Asia in defense of places like Taiwan, which current war gamers are setting out and saying, look, if China was to invade Taiwan right now in the next 5 years, there's a very, very good chance that it does not go well for them. And if the Russians go under, a lot of those weapon shipments are going to stop to Ukraine, and possibly some of them, even though they don't need a lot of the same equipment, some of them, same equipment they do need, some of them might start going more to Taiwan. Javelins, other things like going to Taiwan to deter a possible Chinese invasion, making it so that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan has a higher likelihood of going up in smoke. That's something that the Chinese do not want. That isn't to say that the Chinese and the Russians are like best friends geopolitically. They have a lot of differences. They have things they disagree on. I mean, Alexander Dugin, a pretty well-known nationalist whose daughter was assassinated, goes out and says, in his first edition of the Foundation of Geopolitics, a book that is taught in Russian military academies, that China is inherently a threat to Russia, and it might be a good idea to break up parts of China and absorb them into this new idea of a Russian empire because they are a possible threat to them. Now, that was in the first edition. That book has been now kind of like remastered by Dugin in later editions to take that part out, as they see China as maybe more of a partner against the U.S. imperialists, which they want to cause race war in and conflict in the United States in order to bring it down, because they could never attack from the outside. But I do want to emphasize the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are not inherent allies. They agree on everything. The Chinese are taking advantage of the fact that the Russians are now having to sell their energy exports at a lower cost, not a lower cost, but at a lower price, because they have less buyers. They do not have the infrastructure in place in Asia to replace all of their lost exports to Europe. And the Chinese are taking advantage of that when it comes to the low energy that they're purchasing, which is helping them out. It's helping India out, but it isn't helping the Russians out, besides the fact that at least they have some sort of a buyer. So they're not like perfect allies in every way. But if the Chinese lose the Russians as an ally in the international space, there's nobody to fill that hole against the United States.
That geopolitical instinct really dictates China's behavior at this point.
So does China's sort of cozying up to Russia, how much?
Again, there is the argument that if Russia is humiliated but doesn't collapse, that China could make them more dependent on them, and therefore this pull against the United States is now more dependent on China. Therefore, they have more influence over their decision-making and more influence over Russia. But again, a weaker Russia means a weaker pull against the United States and NATO.
How much does it affect China's relationship with its European trading partners, do you think?
I think it does affect China's relationship with Europe, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of the diplomacy and also in terms of the political optics and the European concern about China aligning itself with Russia and the implications it would have for the war in Ukraine, which is why I think the Chinese are trying to frame itself or present China as a peace broker instead of a Russia accomplice through this trip. So we saw that China made the proposal on the peace settlement of the Ukraine crisis about a month ago. And then earlier in March, China also facilitated the peace deal between Iran and Saudi. So all these are giving the international community, I would say, an illusion that China is now going to emerge as a great mediator between Russia and Ukraine, which I don't think is the primary goal of this trip. And I don't think it is within China's capacity to mediate the peace for the Ukraine war.
Do you anticipate, I mean, obviously, Zelensky, I'm sure, would want to speak to Xi Jinping. Do you anticipate any sort of situation where in the coming days that Xi Jinping ends up speaking to President Zelensky?
Indeed, I think that's very well speculated, and that's very possibly to be happening after Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow. And remember, what the Chinese are trying to do is to frame or present China as a broker. So therefore, they want to present a case of Xi Jinping.
The problem is, though, is that if the Chinese end up putting themselves in a position where they are sending weapons to Russia, they can no longer be an intermediary. Then this is going to move to parties like Turkey, and possibly, depending on how the election goes, that might change the situation, or countries like Oman, which have historically been intermediary between nations. Because now it can't be Sweden, because Sweden has put itself on the path to NATO, which could have been an intermediary in Europe in the past. Finland as well used to be an intermediary between Russia and the rest of Europe before, but now as they're going to NATO, that's going to be difficult. And now it's going to have to go to other nations like possibly Oman, which helped negotiate the Iran deal, and has been known as a historical intermediary between nation states due to its geopolitical position. But I mean, if China does align itself more with Russia, then this idea of them being the intermediary completely goes up in smokes. I don't even think it has a high chance of success or likelihood now, considering that one of the major backers of Ukraine is the United States, and China wants a stronger, more powerful Russia, at least in this respect, due to the fact that they counter the United States.
Jinping conducting shuttle diplomacy between Russia and Ukraine. So Xi Jinping meeting with Putin first, and then having a virtual phone call or a real phone call with President Zelensky. It will give China that image of being the broker conducting shuttle diplomacy between the two.
You mentioned that China doesn't really have the capacity per se to sort of broker a real peace deal.
Yep.
But just explain to us how much China's position on the world stage has been bolstered by this sort of position that it's carving out for itself in this war.
Well, there are pros and cons. There are costs to China's position, and there are also some benefits to China's position. In terms of the cost, most importantly, I would say China understands that its pro-Russia neutrality is doing great damage to China's relationship with the West, including both the United States and Europe. And it also frames China as a dishonest broker or dishonest player in this whole thing. When China presented its peace settlement proposal on February 24th, most people are underwhelmed by how empty and how little substance the deal actually, or the proposal actually offers. So that's not necessarily going to do China more favor in terms of its great power diplomacy. But on the other hand, I think the Chinese also see benefits associated with this ambiguity in terms of the Russian war in Ukraine. Because for a lot of the Chinese strategists, if the Chinese don't take a position, then every country and all the parties to the conflict will want to gain China's favor. They will want to gain China to support their position. So I think there is also this argument that that China should remain neutral or should remain non-committal in terms of its position. Last but not least, remember, for the Chinese, the most important foreign policy consideration is always going to be the United States. So when they think about the Indo-Pacific strategy and the strategic competition with the United States, I think the first question that emerges is that, well, if U.S. is no longer distracted in Ukraine, then how much more attention and how much more resources U.S. will be allocating towards China? And I think that's a real concern.
Right. Yunsun from the Stimson Center think tank, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Oh, did anybody see that photograph of Putin like kneeling to Xi Jinping? Has anybody seen that photograph? Can we bring that photograph up? I think it would just be good to end the segment on. I think it'd be good if we're gonna be talking about this. I think we have to end it with this. Have you guys not seen it? Oh my goodness. Okay, some of you guys actually haven't seen it, so I have to bring it up. Is he kneeling? I thought Putin was just short. No, it looks like he's kneeling in the photograph. Gosh, one second. I'm trying to find it. Here, here it is. Can somebody tell me this is real? Can somebody please tell me that this is a real freeze frame of this interaction? That this isn't just me just like deluding myself into believing this. Please somebody tell me this is real. This is a real freeze frame. Can somebody just say yes, Dylan, that's real? This is a real photograph. He doesn't look desperate at all. Totally not desperate. Totally not desperate. Totally doesn't need a way out. Totally doesn't need China support. No, he's just short. He's on his knees. He's on his knees. That photo looks quite fake. I want to believe it's real. I want to believe it's real so bad. I just say it's, let's just all believe it's real. We'll just believe it's real. No proof, no evidence necessary. We'll just do it, okay? We can believe in one lie. Help me, Xi Jinping. You're my only hope.